Hi everyone. My name is Evelyn Dionne. I am currently a PhD candidate in Université Laval in Quebec City. I'm working with Pierre-Luc Bilodeau. I'm not sure if he's here with us right now online, but he's you probably know him at Université Laval, a professor in the industrial relations. So today I'm going to present to you really preliminary results of my thesis. So right now we want to see if union identity, can it really explain actually how unions position themselves toward actions and policies against climate change. And I'm using the case of Quebec construction industry. So first, I want to talk a bit about why should we care about union positioning. If you were there yesterday in this Just Transition session, it's something that you've heard a bit. But basically, the idea is that workers have to be considered because climate change actions do have impacts on workers. Climate change policies do have impacts on workers. And even if we're not necessarily currently in a just transition, no matter what it can be said of what government are saying, having transition policies and general transitions, that's not what I'm going to stick on today. So I want really to focus on the fact that there are many climate change policies that can change and can affect workers and employment in various ways. For example, if you're going to change which industries are financed or which regions or the policies within a certain industry, you're going to have to consider workers and the qualifications. So we have to be able to have someone who represents these workers, who can voice their concerns and represent their interests in a short and long-term situation. We also have the idea that workers have a double dependency. So they're dependent on their living environment and they're dependent on their work to be able to feed themselves. So this is a really materialistic analysis of the issue, but I think it's something that sometimes we forget when we get lost in the big principles of just transition and environment. But this is a really concrete issue that we have to take into account because, and I think Phyllis and Stevis have made a really interesting case of it, and it was taken again. So this issue is also exacerbated by precarious work or by skills that are not necessarily transferable. So if you are really qualified, it's not going to be a big issue because you can find another job if your qualifications are valid for something else. If your qualifications are not valid for another industry than the one that you're closing right now, or another business because you have I don't like the term, but unqualified work, well, it's not going to be really useful to you outside of the organization that's closing down. And this aspect of precarious work is, well, we have to consider it also for skilled workers, because if you have more skills, but you're also always looking for a new job, it's also something that will impact you a lot. And that's the case of the industry we're talking about today. So construction workers are always finding new works. They can have new jobs. They can have up to 3 employers in a year, sometimes more, sometimes less, depending on the economic situation. So this is something that is really important because workers are in more danger, if you will, when they want to speak up against something because they want to be rehired. And at the same time, where the jobs are created will strongly impact their future possibilities to have a wage. I want to just take a second to talk about Newman and Humphrey's concept of eco-precarity. I think it's something we haven't talked a lot about, but the idea that climate change, the real impact, the warm weather, extreme temperatures, big snowstorms are actually impacting the work of people. This was created for an Australian construction study where workers have to stop because there are too many risks of heat strokes. It can be seen as something really obvious in Australia. Sometimes here in Quebec and Canada, we think about, oh, it's something really far away, but we're actually seeing it now. We're actually seeing an increase in heat strokes. We're actually seeing an increase in work stoppage. So we're talking about days where workers are not able to work. So we're talking about days where the work sites are too icy in the winter because they're not allowed to go to work. So this is something that affects people's pay because they're not able to do their work because of the impacts of climate change right now. So we can see how these things can have really major impacts on workers. And it's not something in 50 years, even in Quebec, Canada. So here today, what I want to start with is the first aspect of my thesis. It's something built on 3 aspects, but the one we're focusing on today is union identity and positioning. And is union identity actually able to be such a factor to understand the factors that affect why union position themselves in a certain way? Why this question? Simply because there is a rich literature that really started with the questioning of union identity using Hyman's triangle of identity. So most studies we're seeing are based on using this basic model. So we have Empton, which is a PhD thesis, really interesting work on union positioning, on just transition. We have Stevis and Felly, we have Goods. So we have a lot of people using this, but Empton really did a really major empirical work in the UK. The thing is, we always see a lot of, like there's a fit between the triangle and between the positioning. And a lot of work seems to be based on literature. Empton is based also on interviews. I want to be clear, it's a major work. But there also seems to be a lot of confusion as to what gives and what are the actual impacts. So if we're taking Thomas and Dorflinger and Martin McIver, they made a really big synthesis, if you will, but you can see that there are a lot of authors using a lot of concepts and all mixing them together with just transition, doing equivalence and a lot of theoretical work. So we're seeing a lot of really interesting literature, but going a bit everywhere and not really understanding the underlying mechanisms behind it. So that's why I want to do with this thesis is going to analyze these underlying mechanism and understand a bit better. I think Kalt made recently this year was just published a really interesting work to go and take all this literature and make a big framework. He's talking more specifically about strategic choice and power resources. I was talked a bit earlier with Ian. And I think today I want you to focus on the idea that we're talking about Quebec construction. Quebec construction as is the same sector. So we're going to talk about unions in the same sector. We're going to talk about unions in the same social, political, economic context. In the same governance context, public discourse, we're not talking about the coalitions here. So we're able to focus on more specific issues to see how these specific aspects. So this is, I think, the strength of this study is that we're able to focus on some elements because many aspects that we have in other studies are actually the same here. So they're not other impacting factors that we have on it. Of course, they are different aspects. It's not a perfect closed system, but it's something that we're able to see. And something that I want to be precise about is that Quebec construction is really regulated. So it is really strongly regulated with a tripartite and a lot of joint committees. So this is something really interesting when we're looking at the idea that they have really strong levers of action. And we're looking at a variety of unions. So we have 5 unions in the construction in Quebec, and all workers have to be members of the union. So it's something that is mandatory. Workers have to join a union in order to access to the construction jobs. And they're all under one of the 4 collective agreements that are bargained by the 5 unions. They're all at the table in order to be able to bargain with the employer representative. So there is a collective representation on the employer side and on the worker side. Now, we're able to see all of this coming together and all being regulated under the R20 bill. So it really is the whole encompassing, if you want, bill for the construction in Quebec. This is not the same for the rest of Canada. I want to be really clear. The rest of Canada is more similar to how the United States construction is regulated with, of course, provincial variations. But the idea is that we have the opportunity to study unions, their identity, and within this construction industry, which is an industry really concerned by these new policies with buildings representing high emission, high polluting, but also high potential for recycling, for reskilling. So this is something that we're able to take even further with the idea that we have tripartism, which is considered, these are direct citations from the ILO report that was just published this year about how tripartism can be really used and is really important, and is even a better tool when we have permanent institutions and that are able to have these social dialogues in order to talk about these issues and implement new and solid ideas. And this is something that we do have in Quebec. So training is always within these strict, solid ideas that we have, and they're always meeting many times per year. Same thing for bargaining every 4 years. So we do have these strong bases. More specifically on the cases, right now, the analysis of all the unions is definitely not over. This is a major work, but here we have, really, just to be clear, one international union separated within locals, and each local really is bargaining all the labor relations inside. Then we have another union that was typically born from a division within this international union. And this one is not anymore an international union, but it is also local organized. So the locals are also responsible for their own management inside under their specific construction unions. And on the other side, the one from a Catholic union heritage, because the Catholic unions were really strong here in Quebec, where the church was, Catholic Church was really strong within all the, governance, education, and everything that we had in the last century. So these unions, we have 3 unions that were born from these values. One is specific to the construction specifically and encompasses more trades and occupations. And we have 2 others, which one has historically been linked to more social action, collective action, and another one which was born out of the creation from not specifically wanting to be involved in these political actions. So I could go on for a long time about this heritage, but it was just to give you a general idea of these structures and how they have different organization and how these can be factors that we're going to be looking into the second phase of this big project. As you can see, the International Union, of course, have different opportunities. And this is something that's really getting out of this study, is how their international network can really be used and leveraged in order to access some things that the Quebec system is not officially able to offer them. So what we're seeing is that a lot of the official, more industrial-based unions have their limited network within the province. Of course, there's intertrade unions within the Quebec where they can access, but since it is not based and organized on local, this network is harder actually, and there are less formal meeting sites where you can actually reach and share these ideas, or have people go for training and then come back and implement these training ideas in order to share these new technologies within their trade. So here we use really the case studies for it was at the basis 5 unions, but right now we have 1 union that is probably going to have to be taken out of the study because we cannot have access to, sadly, the union. It happens, field work. And we have 4 embedded cases. And right now we're basing ourselves, of course, on documentation, meetings, memoirs, every public statement taken on these issues. And also we were able to access another parallel studies that we're doing on climate literacy and how it is thought in the construction trades in Quebec. So we were able to have access to a lot of interviews, which is really data rich. That's why the analysis, of course, is not over. But what we're seeing here, I don't know where my time is, but what we're seeing here with the preliminary findings within the more business-oriented locals is something really interesting that isn't necessarily going with the equation that we saw at the beginning, where business are going with really market ideas led by businesses, or really business-centered locals are being really oppositional to what any idea of climate change might bring. What we're seeing is actually a really interested. It's actually really interesting to say. I was honestly surprised as a researcher to see how something that was seen as something so far from what we can consider as construction. At first, I was talking with other researchers about this project, and people were telling me, oh, that's going to be a really hard field, you know. But then I got there and it was actually really interesting. People were really open to receive, to share, and to be, well, it seemed really honest and fit with the documentation about people having ideas and innovations and sharing about their barriers and saying, yes, we're trying to do something, but we don't know how. So what we're seeing is how people are really telling us about opportunities that they would want to be able to use, but they feel really limited by the structure. So it's a double-sided coin. We have this really strong regulated market, employment market with really strong, really solid training centers that are not trade union based, that are thought within the formal education system, with the high school system, within really the same employers, everything. And everything has to be tripartite. So everything is really heavy, really long. What we're seeing is that a lot of discouragement from the union saying the training is 10 years behind. How do you want us to be, you know, at the edge, cutting edge of new technologies? How do you want us to be able to train them within windmills when we're basically not able to have access in our basic training of pre-apprenticeship programs to actual up-to-date training? So this is an issue that we're seeing with this idea of regulation and how peoples are actually trying to implement other strategies. What we're seeing also is how they can maneuver differently depending if they're international unions or not. So here we have two different cases, one in an international union, one not in an international unions, both local unions here, not central, general unions. So we're seeing that one is really leveraging their international relations in order to have representative train in the United States, where they have access to trade union-based training centers, because the trade unions are really in control of the training. So if they have the funds and their willingness to do this training, they're able to access it in a much easier way than here, where they have to go and negotiate with all the actors, which include also general trade, who may not be as interested in those really specific training, and the public funds, which are really limited to access these trainings. So they're able to get these informations and training outside and bring them back here in Quebec, and then share this knowledge inside to be able to train properly their members. So it's something we see that is really interesting, where they're able to look forward and see, oh, this big project is coming. We know this is something that our workers are going to need, and we want to be able to train them. But when they're trying to be able to call within the organization that regulates it, everything is the Quebec Construction Commission, where we have the training regulation, they're being blocked. They're not being listened, and they feel like only the businesses are being heard for their needs in training. So they're looking somewhere else. So it's really interesting how these international unions are looking in this side to be able to leverage it, and how the non-international union is looking more inside within their members to be able to leverage other information and go within the Quebec environment to be able to use these resources, more local resources, in order to access these trainings. So we see that there's a lot of questioning about skills, about trade jurisdiction. Trade jurisdiction is, don't worry, it's a major part of this project. It's going to be the third aspect. The third phase is how trade jurisdiction is affected, because something that is coming out really clearly is with new technologies, you get new questions about who does what. We're talking about the simple difference between two trades might be what type of liquid is going through a pipe. One is going to a trade, the other is going to the other trade. So we're talking about if the transformation is being done before or after, depending on the process, depending on the technology. You have different trades who have different jobs. So this affects a lot. So which is really interesting here. And what I think I want you to remember is that we're doing something, and what we're finding here is, well, really interesting information about how unions and what factors actually inform their decision, their actions, And I'm really looking forward to present you the next results in the next congresses. And I'll be happy to answer all of your questions. But definitely, I think the comments that was brought yesterday by Ian about, is it really a just transition happening, is something that I can really see here within the two UDs, not really feeling that this is a transition happening, but more of a technological changes, and how it's going to be taken will differ a lot. So thank you very much for your time.